3 women vanished from a quiet house overnight without a single sign of a struggle. A cadet walks off one of the most secure campuses in America and is never seen again. And a missing girl from Vatican City pulls investigators into sealed tombs and decades of alleged cover-ups. These are people who disappeared and were never found again. In June 1992, 3 women vanished from a house in Springfield, Missouri. Cheryl Levitt lived there with her daughter, Susie Streeter. Susie and her friend Stacy McCall had just graduated high school and came back to Cheryl's place around 2 in the morning after their graduation celebrations. The next morning, friends stopped by to pick them up for a trip to a water park. Nobody answered the door. All 3 cars were still in the driveway. Their purses were inside with money and ID still in them. The family dog was the only one home. The beds looked like they'd been slept in, but there's no sign of a struggle anywhere in the house. The only thing that seemed off was a broken glass globe on the front porch light. No shoes were taken, nothing was missing, so where were they? Well, there was a massive search, but it never really got anywhere. Investigators searched parking garages and farms across the area. They found absolutely nothing. Days turned to weeks, and then years. To this day, the case is still unsolved. In January 1950, Richard Cox was a student at West Point Military Academy in New York. On January 14th, a man showed up on campus asking for him. The man gave his name only as George. Cox told his roommates he was heading out to dinner with this person, walked off the grounds, and never came back. The cadet had met up with this mysterious George guy before. Cox said he was a former U.S. Army Ranger who really liked bragging about who he killed during the war, to a disturbing degree. After meeting with George the first time, Cox had come back to campus totally intoxicated and just passed out in bed. Nobody knows where they went the second time, but West Point is not a place where people just slip away. It's one of the most disciplined, monitored institutions in the country. When Cox missed his evening check-in, it set off a major response involving both the military and the FBI, who were pretty confused by all this because his roommate said Cox had seemed genuinely uneasy about George. Somebody who apparently knew from his earlier military service in Europe. But if he felt so weirded out by him, why would he just wander off alone with him to dinner more than once? Well, over the years, there have been plenty of theories. One was that he was recruited into some kind of covert government operation. Well, maybe George revealed something to Cox he shouldn't have and decided he needed to silence him. It's possible, but we'll never be able to say for sure. Emanuela Orlandi was a teenage girl who lived inside Vatican City, where her father had a job working directly for the Vatican. In June 1983, she left home to head to a flute lesson and never came back. Because of her family's connection to the Vatican, the disappearance immediately pulled in some very powerful people and organizations. Anonymous phone calls came in claiming she was being held and would only be released if authorities freed a prisoner who'd attempted to kill a major world leader. Decades passed and the case only got more tangled. Investigators opened old tombs and searched hidden rooms beneath ancient buildings based on tips that came in over the years. Every lead seemed to die the moment it got close to the Vatican. Now, it's pretty common to hear in this case that people in high positions very likely knew more than they were letting on, but nothing's ever been proven. Their families continued to push for answers for over 40 years, but unfortunately they still haven't gotten the closure that they deserve. Jean Spangler was an actress living in Los Angeles. In October 1949, she told her family she had a night shoot in a film set and left the house. She never showed up at any studio. 2 days later, her purse was found in a park not far from her home. The straps had been torn, like someone had grabbed at it, but the weird part was her money and everything else was still sitting inside. There was also a handwritten, unfinished note in the purse addressed to someone named Kirk, mentioning plans to meet up while her mother was away to deal with some kind of personal issue. Police reached out to Kirk Douglas, actually. He called them first to make it clear that he wasn't involved. Investigators also looked into a doctor in the area who was known for performing illegal medical procedures, wondering if Spangler had gone to him and something had gone badly wrong. Her photo went up on posters all over California, but not a single credible sighting ever came in. Guma Aguiar was a very wealthy man who'd built his fortune in the energy industry. In June 2012, a surveillance camera outside his home in Fort Lauderdale captured him climbing onto his motorboat alone and heading out into the Atlantic Ocean. The weather that night was rough, with choppy water, and the following morning the boat drifted back to shore on its own. The lights were still on, the engines were still idling, and his wallet and cell phone were still sitting undisturbed on the deck. There was no damage to the boat, nothing to suggest anyone else had been involved. Search teams spent days covering the water with helicopters and divers, but they found absolutely nothing. People close to him did notice he'd been behaving a little off in the weeks before this happened, which led some to believe he may have staged the whole thing to disappear intentionally and start over somewhere else. Others figured it was probably more simple than that, just an accident. He got knocked overboard. But with no body ever recovered, there's always going to be that room for doubt. In July 2007, Barbara Bolick went hiking in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana with a friend who was visiting from out of town. They were making their way toward a scenic overlook when the friend stopped for a moment to look at the view. Barbara was walking about 20 feet behind him at that point. He turned back around less than a minute later, and she was gone. He called out for her and checked the surrounding area immediately, but there was no sign of her. And there had been no sound of a fall, no cry, no movement in the brush. The terrain at that particular spot wasn't really steep or especially hazardous either, so this was incredibly baffling. Search and rescue teams went out with dogs, heat sensing equipment, and a bunch of volunteers. They found no footprints, no torn clothing, no dropped gear. There was nothing to indicate which direction she might have gone. Investigators took a close look, of course, at the friend she was hiking with, but they just didn't have enough evidence to pin the disappearance on him, so this one's still unsolved. Rico Harris was a former professional basketball player who'd played for the Harlem Globetrotters. He stood close to 7 feet tall. In October 2014, he was driving north from Los Angeles to Seattle to move in with his girlfriend when he pulled off into a remote park. Days went by, and when no one heard from him, people started looking. His car was found at the park with a dead battery. His backpack and cell phone were on the ground nearby. When investigators went through his phone, they found videos he'd recorded of himself outside, walking and talking, appearing calm and in good spirits. After those videos, nothing. In the days after his car was discovered, though, police did get reports from people having seen an extremely tall man walking along the highway after dark in the area. Search teams went through the surrounding canyons and forests, but they came up empty. Just like all the others, it's a really strange case, but this one feels extra odd given how hard a guy like Rico Harris is to miss. I mean, at nearly 7 feet tall, 300 pounds, you'd think it'd be nearly impossible to just vanish like this. Sadly, it's just not the case. It's scary to think, but this case really goes to show it doesn't matter how big you are, anyone can go missing. In September 1988, Tara Calico left her home in Belen, New Mexico for a bike ride on a stretch of road she used all the time. Before she left on this day, though, she told her mother something that would haunt her for the rest of her days. "If I'm not back by noon, come looking for me." Well, Tara wasn't back by noon. She never came back. Along the route, investigators found pieces of a shattered Walkman and a cassette tape on the road. The case took a much darker turn about a year later, though, when a woman discovered a Polaroid photograph lying in a parking lot in Port St. Joe, Florida. The photo showed a young woman and a boy, both bound and gagged, lying in the back of a van. Tara's mother looked at the photo and was immediately convinced the girl was her daughter, specifically pointing to a scar on the leg that matched one Tara had. Forensic analysts were brought in, but they couldn't really reach a definitive conclusion on whether it was actually her. The boy in the photo was never identified, and sadly, the case is yet to be solved. Stephen Kubacki went on a solo skiing trip near Lake Michigan in February 1978, and he didn't return. When searchers went looking for him, they found his skis and backpack sitting at the edge of the frozen lake. There was a trail of footprints in the snow that went out onto the ice and then just stopped, so the assumption was that he had gone through the ice and drowned. That was the story for the next 15 months. But then in May 1979, Stephen turned up, sitting in a field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, roughly 700 miles from where he disappeared. He was wearing clothes he'd never seen before and had a bag containing maps and handwritten hitchhiking notes. People, of course, they had so many questions. Mainly, where the hell have you been? What happened? Well, Stephen couldn't really ease their minds. He had absolutely no memory of the last year and 3 months. He didn't even know he'd been reported missing. He went back to university, completed his degree, and carried on with his life, but that missing stretch of time never came back to him. It remains the only known case of its kind where someone vanished completely for this long and then reappeared with no explanation. Jim Thompson was an American businessman who'd become well known throughout Southeast Asia for reviving the Thai silk industry and turning it into a global product. Well, in March 1967, he was staying with friends at a cottage in the Cameron Highlands, a cooler, forested hill region in Malaysia. One afternoon, after having tea with his hosts, he mentioned he was stepping outside for a short walk and left without his jacket, his cigarettes, or his daily medication, things he would not have left behind if he planned to be gone long. He never came back inside, though. Because of his background with U.S. intelligence, the search for Jim Thompson was massive. Soldiers, local trackers, and guides, they searched the area around the cottage for weeks, but the strange part is, the forest there wasn't really especially thick, and Thompson was someone who knew how to handle himself outdoors. Still, they found absolutely nothing, no sign that anyone had even walked through the area. And that has been the video for today. I will catch you, yes, you specifically, next time.